Thank you all for coming. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about how I've structured this presentation. The presentation is designed around recapping key elements of the SAMR and TPACK model with a view to their application in the classroom. So I'll be showing a couple of examples. And then I'm going to pick one particular example from one area just to show the additional type of, shall we say, specific focus that can be particularly useful in terms of implementing these models in the classroom. So I want to spend roughly, it's going to be close to an hour on that. And then after that, what I want to do is discuss the draft plan that I have a copy of, as well as some questions that you forwarded to me. So let me get this started then. So let me start out with something that's a preamble, I would argue, to what I would call any educational project that's going to bring technology into the classroom. And that's the following. I've found over the years that one of the things that has blocked good uses of technology in schools have been what I would call poor metaphors for what that technology is. And more and more, and particularly in the context of a couple of very recent developments I've been working with over the past 2 years now, I've found that sometimes if you can get the metaphor changed at the outset, or if you can get a different metaphor in place, even before you start anything else, you're well on your way to getting a very different type of thinking about the technology. The type of metaphors that haven't worked are the ones that are embedded in the name of the technology we use. So in English, computer, something that's a big calculator. It is, but that's not necessarily the most interesting use in education, and unfortunately it tends to stress too much, well, the repetitive use for repetitive things, and then we get into use for repetitive drilling as a projection of that. Not a great use. The other one of the common metaphors that we see in terms of naming the technology, you'll see it in French, for instance, with ordinateur, a big filing cabinet, right? A base which you put a lot of index cards with information in. Again, not incorrect as far as it goes, but again, not necessarily the most useful metaphor for education. It tends to stress the side of accumulation of information in the student's head. And then you get into, well, how much do you accumulate in the student's head and how much do you accumulate in the machine and how does the machine help accumulation? Not, again, the greatest metaphor for education. So instead I say, well, let's take a step back. Let's look at the research on uses of computers in education and use that to ground a metaphor. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to build up a metaphor by looking at that research. Now, I like to go back in time, and this is where some of the people who know me brace themselves and say, oh God, is he going to go 30,000 years back all the way to the caves, 15 to 30,000 years ago to cave paintings at sites like Lascaux and Altamira? No, I'm not going that far back today. I do that for some topics like digital storytelling, but that's not today. But I am going back to 1945. 1945 is important in terms of building up this metaphor because it's when Vannevar Bush, who worked in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations in the United States, publishes a paper that's titled As We May Think. And what he's talking about is the following. He says, look, when you give people tools for handling large volumes of information and doing things like interconnecting that information. So I have an index card, and tapping on that index card can bring up another index card. For looking at large volumes of data and looking at it graphically in different ways, right? Then it's not just a question of, oh, I know a little bit better what to do with this. You start thinking differently. Hence the title of the paper, As We May Think. Now, it's important to realize that sometimes this paper is mispresented. It's presented as a speculative paper. Well, it's true that the technology he was describing, called the MEMEX, you see a couple of pictures here, didn't exist at the time that he was talking about it. But he was drawing upon roughly a decade's worth of research in terms of how people can interact with this type of use of data and so on. Well, if the technology didn't exist, how do you do it? I mean, electronic, he posited a electromechanical system. Electronic computers at that time, barely a couple existed and were unreliable and far too expensive to use anyway for this. Well, no, But over the past decade, first because of the New Deal policies as a response to the Great Depression of '29 of the Roosevelt administration, and then after that, the need to move personnel, materials, etc., that was demanded by World War II, the FDR administration had developed a huge body of research and knowledge in terms of how do you deal with all this information on a scale that had never been necessary before. One of the things that people don't realize about the response, not just in the US, obviously, but that's where I'm drawing this information from, but across the world, successful response to the Great Depression, was that it required rethinking how you handled large volumes of economic data. How you handled, in the United States, for instance, migration of workers was hugely important. Suddenly you were dealing not with demographic information every 10 years because of the census. You're dealing with demographic information that was changing month to month, and in some crucial cases, week to week or day to day. Nobody had ever handled that volume of information on that scale before. So how do you do it? Well, you have computers, but computers meant a room full of people with Burroughs hand calculators cranking through the data. It meant you figured out ways to move large filing cabinets on wheels. Okay, today's modern day filing cabinet is a development of this era, right? But you could quickly get to different locations. It meant that you started figuring out how to handle index cards. You know, many of the researchers of this time, today it may seem silly, but one of the big discoveries was how do you create a legible index card that can be copied and reproduced and can hold this type of data. So there's a decade worth of research, and he's saying, you know, when people have access to this, now granted, right now it takes a whole government to do this, but he could see a time when the technology would enable an individual to do this. People think differently. That was Vannevar Bush's key insight, that he wasn't just seeing better use of the data, he was seeing people think in new ways they'd never thought about. Okay. Move forward to about 1968, Doug Engelbart. Doug Engelbart, who has been working with his team for close to a decade, roughly, give or take, comes out and makes a big flyer, makes a very big presentation, sometimes called the mother of all demos, in which everything that you use in a computer today is shown. The mouse, graphic interfaces, first video conferencing demonstrated ever, remote access to client-server systems, access to database, display of database information in multiple formats, hyperlinking, hiding or showing information according to interest. In a 1-hour demo, the seeds for all of modern use of computer technology are sown. That's great. That's what everybody focuses on, but there's something more important than that. Because Doug Engelbart was not doing this just to demo, oh, nice new toys. He was saying, well, take the insight of Vannevar Bush, process it through what had then by that point become reasonably affordable technology, at least universities could afford these machines, and by the time he's doing it, some schools could too. And then say what is needed to implement this, but not just because, but because we're talking about changing how we may think. And he takes it a little step further in terms of his research and says, you know what, it's even more than thinking differently. What he sees in his research coming out, and by the way, he continued, people always stop the discussion of Doug's career at this point, but he continued working for many years, and I've had the honor of meeting him and actually being able to thank him for his research. His key focus is saying what we see happening with this technology is you don't just think differently in the context of using it. It starts changing how you think overall, period. So what he says is the real stake here is what he calls augmenting human intellect. In other words, it becomes a question not of the computer allowing you to think differently about something in this context, but allowing you to think differently even when you don't have the computer in front of you. It just changes, it augments, it increases your thinking capacity. It also augments your intellect in the capacity to learn new things. So both of those are crucial aspects that come from Doug Engelbart's work. And I emphasize, again, it's not in a vacuum. It's not, I think this may be the case. You know, he's got a decade of research. If you follow his career afterwards, he refined this to 5 key principles aspect. Some fascinating work that's now being continued by his daughter, Christina Engelbart. And, you know, amazing work. We don't need to get into that today, but I do want to emphasize they didn't just stop here. They went on. But for our purposes, we can take this. Great, so other researchers have been working either with Doug's team or in close proximity to Doug's team. One of them, Alan Kay. 1973, Alan has now had about a decade's worth of work as well under his belt. Among other things, some of the precursors to the modern graphic interface that you use in any drawing program is Alan's research work. But one of the key things he's also been working on is, fine, we've got this. We have Doug's great work, and bringing into play what Vannevar Bush had thought about, but at a really deep level. He's saying, well, obviously, we want to find out what happens with children. What type of environment is necessary for a child to be able to get to this point of augmenting human intellect? And the paper results, published in '73, is a personal computer for children of all ages. This is by one of the first mentions ever of the term personal computer. And these are the original sketches that Alan includes there. And this is, again, not hypothetical. He's saying, well, based upon my research, this is a device we can't build today. Actually, Xerox did make a few prototypes of a device like this. There were a couple of others, but it was estimated that at that point in time, it would have cost, each one would have had to be handmade, and each one would have cost around $10,1973. I leave it to you to apply inflation to find out how much that would be in today's dollars. A little expensive. But he had the idea of, not just the idea, but the result from his research of saying, well, it has to be a device on the scale of the child with certain capabilities, like those shown by Doug. So I'm fascinated by the fact that he's doing this in 1973, and it looks like a cross between. Yeah, it's one of those things that you look at. Wow, he got it pretty much right. And with graphics interface and so on. But one more key thing: it has to be one-to-one. So each child needs one. That's why you have each one of them here, not the children sitting around the terminal, which, by the way, was already being tested at that point in time. He could already point out to the research. The specific project was called the Play-Doh project. I actually came in on some of my own research started on the tail end of the Play-Doh project. And one of the things about the Play-Doh project was there was a great deal of information discovered about how children learn with computers. But one of the things that was discovered is having children all file into a basement room to share a terminal hooked up to a mainframe somewhere is not the best way to do it. All right. So he already had that information. He said, well, look, we know why it's not working well to just have the lab. We see the problems that occurred. The child has to have access to a technology, one-to-one on a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week basis, if we want then what Doug has observed to be implemented at a deep level in education for children. That same year, 1973, in actually the same conference the paper is presented, Seymour Papert presents a paper that's closely connected to Alan's. Because Seymour says, well, okay, he knows, of course, of all of this work, and he's been working along a somewhat different direction. He says, well, Alan is working on what it's going to take to make this feasible for all children. I'm working on, let's actually see what happens. How far can we push this? If we actually make the tools for children to learn in this way, how far can they go? How deep is this augmentation of human intellect? And the paper is called, with good reason, on making a theorem for a child. The research that Seymour is carrying out here, and it would continue, of course, over the next few decades, is that it's not just that you have a child and he's created this special programming language, Logo, that is designed to teach children math and geometry. Okay, that was the goal of Logo. Sometimes it gets obscured. People just see the pretty pictures and assume it was a simplistic language. It wasn't. It's actually a very deep language derived from Lisp, oriented towards how do you get kids to think about, particularly geometry as the first one, but mathematics more generally. So he starts working with the kids with this. He says, well, how deep can you go? And he finds that if you use the tool correctly, working with the children, with kindergartners in some cases, you can get the result that these kids in kindergarten are now thinking about area, for instance, as a key concept, at a level that's as or more sophisticated than a doctoral candidate in mathematics focusing on the same topic. Think about that for a second. We're not talking about a kid learning to do their multiplication tables a little faster. We're not talking about saying, well, they learn algebra a year earlier. We're talking about acquiring a deep understanding of a key mathematical concept, not just a little bit, but it is simply a different dimension. I mean, we could say how many years before, say, a Ph.D. candidate, but that doesn't really get at the heart of it. We're talking about a deep augmentation of human intellect. These are kids that are simply going to think about mathematics in different ways. And in fact, if you follow the trajectories of some of the kids that came out of the Logo programs, you do indeed find some deep thinkers in the sciences and mathematics in different ways. So, but that's what's at stake here. That's what Seymour says, this is what we go for, not a little bit of just a little bit faster or just a little bit better. If you do it right, you get deep results. And he proved it by actually doing it. Take all of this together, and this gives you the basis for that metaphor I said that we want to construct at the beginning. Because what you're trying to do then is to say, we're not going to use the computer as a giant calculator or as a giant filing cabinet. We want to use it as a way to augment children's, anybody's, but let's say children, since that's who we all work with, children's learning, and to augment children's capacity to learn in deep ways. That, I think, is the metaphor we want to go in. This is the mental picture we want to go in. Not just to do the same thing a little bit better, but to actually say, no, we want to change the rules of the game. We want to see what happens. We will get to that point where this kid is now saying, well, I have a challenge now. This kid now understands area in this deep way. I'm going to have to rethink what I think of mathematics for this kid, because it is such a dramatic sea change. This kid can handle information in ways I haven't ever encountered before. Okay? So how does this all change the rules of the game? That I think is the type of metaphor you will construct. Now let's also be clear, this doesn't happen overnight. Okay? It's not the sort of thing where you say to teachers, do this, and if your child isn't working at a PhD level in mathematics tomorrow, you're doing things wrong. No, 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 no. Okay? It's a process. And it is also true, by the way, that, as I say, we have a lot more research since Seymour did. This is one of the earliest papers of it. It is the earliest paper of it, sorry, in 73. But obviously, you obtain different results in different areas, what's feasible, what's not feasible, how you have to rethink programs, etc. It's not as simple as saying, and then a flash of inspiration happens. But it gives you the underlying metaphor. It gives you a target to strive for. It gives you something that underpins the rest of what you do. All right. So briefly, I'm going to now reintroduce, in this context, with this hopefully in the back of your minds, the SAMR model. And the SAMR model is the result of my asking the question, why is it that if you have equal technology, equal software, equal professional development, and equal socioeconomic status in some schools, I started observing this back in the 80s, you still see sometimes wildly different results. And remember, it used to be, if you look back at the literature, at least the vendor literature for the period, you'd find that, well, just buy the right technology and all will be well. Okay? But that all was not well. And it's a question of, so what does it look like? Why is it? What are the fundamental differences in terms of how these people are doing things? And you have to say, it wasn't a question of smart school, stupid school. No, it wasn't that simple. There was something else going on. And that's why I spent researching a large portion of my time from roughly the late 80s through the 90s. And by the year 2000 or thereabouts, the model had solidified, based upon my research, into its current form, which said, okay, the different outcomes you observe are the result of 4 different levels in terms of how people use technology. Okay? Substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition are the names of the 4 levels. And of course, I couldn't come up with a snappy name for the project. So one of my colleagues, when Brent in Arizona, said, Ruben, SAMR, it's a perfectly pronounceable acronym. Why don't you just use the acronym? I said, great, Wayne, I've got to go to a conference in 24 hours, that's the name I'm going to give it for the purposes of the conference, and it's stuck. So hence the SAMR model. All right, so let's go through the levels. Substitution level. You were using one technology, and now you're replacing it with another technology, but in exactly the same way you were doing it before. All right? Now, usually when I've been explaining this in the past, in fact, it was one of the examples I used in my early research. I used to talk about word processor replacing a typewriter. But these days, I walk into a room, I start talking about IBM Selectrics and blank eyes everywhere because I'm the only person in the room that remembers the IBM Selectric. So I don't do that anymore. Let me talk about it in terms of a current technology, a very current issue. Let's talk about this in terms of ebook readers. If you have an ebook reader, Kindle, an iPad being used just for an ebook reader, etc., and you use it as a straight substitute for paper books, that's great. Students don't have to carry heavy bags full of books anymore, better for their backs. You can save a little bit of money sometimes, that's nice. Convenience is there, great. But it doesn't change anything fundamentally in terms of reading the paper book versus reading the ebook. And the model predicts That's great. You've set the basis for something else in motion, but student outcomes themselves will remain unmodified. And we now have the research in that says, yep, that's right. Every single ebook study that has looked at an ebook reader use that's at the substitution level has reported no change in student outcomes. None. That's what the model predicts. That's why we predict it. But there's been a lot of disappointed people. I'm saying, no, look, you shouldn't be disappointed. That's simply a result of where you're using it. If you're going to use this as the basis for something else, that's great. If you're not, well, you really haven't changed the conditions of learning very much. So substitution level usage doesn't change the outcome for students, but it can set the basis for what you're going to do later. And I always point out there's nothing bad with substitution, as I can say a basis. It's also the easiest point of entry for many teachers, and it's not a bad idea to start there. At the augmentation level, though, is when you start saying, well, the ebook reader allows us to do some things we couldn't do before. So one of the things that everybody points out is, well, you tap on a word and it brings up a dictionary definition. Okay, that is a functional improvement over what you were doing for the same task reading the book. But to be perfectly honest, it's a tiny little improvement. It's a little bit better, but when we've done studies, the difference between tapping on the word and having the dictionary next to you is pretty minimal. But there are other functional enhancements that are more important. For instance, one important enhancement is that an ebook reader can synthesize a spoken word from the text in it. And today's synthesized voices are pretty good. They're no longer the robotic voices we used to have in the past. That means that students have access to the information in that book through multiple channels, both the visual, textual, as well as the audio access. And that's useful for any student to have these multiple access. And that is a significant enhancement that you couldn't get from the earlier technology unless you're a school that's wealthy enough to be able to pay for somebody to sit next to a student and be able to read the text to them on command. If you're that wealthy, please let me know how you got that much funding. I'd love to hear the secret. But it's essential for students who either because of a visual impairment or because of a cognitive challenge cannot easily process the text in its printed form. So that's a functional improvement that's obviously beyond what we were talking about with the dictionary. And there's one more that I'm going to mention because I'm going to use it in the later levels. You can always annotate in the margins of a paper book, highlight text, etc. You can also do that with any ebook reader. That would still be straight substitution, but there's one more possibility that you can use in terms of the ebook reader, and that's for it to export those annotations, that highlighted text, as files. Some of the more sophisticated ones allow you to cross-link how you're exporting that hypertext, lots of possibilities there. And that is a strong functional improvement, because before, well, you could tell a student, okay, and now that you've highlighted and written in the margins of your book, I want you to type that out. Right. I don't think most students have either the time or the will to do that. So strictly speaking, it was never a realistic option in the past. But also think about the fact that this makes the text available for other uses. And that is a functional improvement that's going to lead us to something we're going to see at the next level. In terms of my research, when you look at the type of impact here, you do start seeing small positive impacts upon student outcomes. Assuming that you're using some type of instrument that you've calibrated against traditional measures. Here's where I have to put 20 caveats to make sure you don't look at this as a very exact number that you must be targeting. But if you're looking at the average, when I look at the data that was available to me and has become available since, at the augmentation level, you start seeing impact on student learning on the order of around, on average, a quarter of a standard deviation improvement or so. Okay, so assuming you have some type of standardized measure, that's what you see here. And be aware there is a considerable amount of slack, but that's the scale that you're looking at. So in terms of some of the standard traditions for how you gauge significant levels of difference in terms of student assessment and outcomes, you're looking at a quarter of a significant level. Not bad, but not huge. I will point out, though, that this is already bigger than some of the other effects that people have looked at. For instance, when you look at comparable effects for reducing class size, so you have a class with 30-odd students in it and you take it down to about 17 students, you get smaller sizes on the order of about 1/10 of a standard deviation or so. So even though it's small, it still is noticeable and it still is better than some of the more traditional measures that people have taken to improve student results. At the modification level, we're now taking an additional step. We're significantly redesigning the test. So before we were talking about reading the book, Now let's talk about redesigning the task of reading the book. You can have the annotations published automatically to Twitter. In fact, several people I follow on Twitter do this as they're reading. They export their highlights and annotations. You can export to Facebook. You can export to a blog or a wiki or other forms of social sharing of text. And I think what this makes possible. This makes it possible for you to have a class where students are sharing socially their reading as they're going along. And in a very different way from saying, let's all read chapter 1 and then get together to discuss it. That's great. That's useful. That was what you could do always before. Here you're talking about students being able to see the process of each other's reading as they go along, the evolution, the development of understanding, the questions, the misunderstandings, etc. that our students have. Well, this is very valuable in more ways than one. One, it makes more information available to them from the collection of all of the group without having to construct some type of complex collaborative project. In other words, it's transparent in terms of this collaborative social reading that's in effect taking place. But there's a couple of other things that are very important. And from the viewpoint of formative assessment, we know that one of the best things that students can do is have within those formative assessment tools that make them more aware of their own learning processes. But we also know from the research into formative assessment that for most students, these processes are not directly easily available to them just examining the evolution of their own work, but they become more easily available if they can look at somebody else's evolution of their work and then reflect back on their own. So the fact that they can see the other students thinking while they're reading this book makes them more easily able to go back and look at their own evolution of thinking. So it's a very powerful tool in that regard. So that'll be an example of a use of the technology at the modification level. And at the modification level, we see substantial improvements in student outcomes. What I mean by substantial, on the order of somewhere between 1/2 to 8/10 of a standard deviation. So now, again, if you're looking at the equivalent, for instance, in the United States, you'd say it's half a letter grade. If you're looking at standard, significant tiers of achievement, it's half to almost a full tier of achievement that you're looking at. And that's something that's becoming really noticeable. The big payoff comes at the end when you go to the redefinition level. At the redefinition level, you're saying, so far we've been talking about keep the task the same, still at modification, but redesign aspects, add features onto it, change features using the technology. At the redefinition level is when you're saying, now let's take a step back and say, are there new tasks that of course have to be of educational value? You can always create silly tasks, but well, fine, that's true of anything. So are there other new tasks of significant educational value that are made possible by the technology in ways that could never have been done before without the presence of technology? So this is where you're opening up the panorama to the type of Seymour-Papert question of, can I create new tasks for the students so that they, for instance, become these incredible geometers at age 5? So the redefinition level is where you see these, biggest changes. I'll get to the magnitude of those changes in just a second, but let's put it in the context of this particular example so we wrap it up. We've been building up what I call a Sammer ladder, where you start out at the substitution level with certain usage, build up through augmentation, through modification. Let's say we stay with this, we get to the redefinition level. What could we do with everything we've built up here? How will we take it to this next level? We say, well, okay, we've had the students now develop their better understanding of their own cognitive developmental processes, their own reading processes, others' reading processes through the social reading aspect. Let's have them become teachers to each other. Now again, nothing new in that. I mean, you can go back to Dewey, and Dewey writes about this, and we know from assessment research that that's one of the best things you can do, again, in terms of formative assessment, in terms of students' learning experiences. But let's give it a twist, and the twist is the interesting one, because we say we now want you going at the deep level into this teaching, because we want you to communicate the key ideas, key concepts of this book that you've just read to somebody that's in a culture that's not your own. We don't want you just telling your classmates. You've already in effect done that. We want you to take it to the point where you say, communicate the key ideas of the book to somebody in a culture outside your own who may not even share your original common language. And you can do that, of course, using the technology, either via text-based or other-based social tools like blogs or wikis, or you can use direct communication via Skype, for instance, or other chatting tools. Which one is appropriate is going to vary, obviously, with the project. But think about what this does. This is something you couldn't have done before. Okay, if any of you have ever done pen pal exchanges with foreign schools, for instance, you can do it. But it tends to be hesitant. It's a bit of a kludge, and it's very limited in the scope of what you can do. But here you can say, no, no, I want you working with schools, say, in the States, in Japan, where have you, where you're trying to communicate this, because obviously you also don't want to pick a trivial example or an interesting example. You obviously would like a book that has cultural relevance to both sides. Maybe it's an experience, let's say, if we talked about consequences of current economic situations, for instance, both sides are looking at certain situation of hardship, but it's a question of each one sees it differently. Can we get something from this exchange if we have this reciprocal teaching type approach? Okay. This is
with Greece.
Not
with Greece. I mean, there has to be a limit somewhere.
I'm going to, I think, remain quiet on that topic, particularly given some of the discussions resulting from the recent agreements, right? But what I was going to say is then that this is where you're now creating a new task. It's, of course, connected to, based upon what you were doing before, so it's not a complete departure, but it's a new task with great educational value to you that you could not have done before. You would have liked to do it before, but you simply couldn't because you didn't have the technology, and that has the potential for great payoff. It also has, by the way, the one aspect that is interesting is that it also has the capacity to build out the students' autonomy in terms of saying, well, how can you take more control of your own learning by becoming a teacher to others. So there's some very real potential there. And the type of improvement in student outcomes we see at the redefinition level goes from roughly around 0.8 of a standard deviation, give or take, to as much as 2 standard deviation improvements. That's the most we've seen. Now, one of the interesting points here is, for those of you who are familiar with Wahlberg and Bloom's work back in the 80s, 2 standard deviations is the maximum improvement that has ever been observed, or had ever been observed up to that point, using traditional methodologies in student outcomes. The two standard deviation improvement was observed in the context of having a student who had a tutor available to them at their beck and call, who was both an expert in the content area for that tutor, as well as an expert in tutoring, in pedagogy, in other words. That was produced that kind of outcome. Again, if you have a school like that can afford that for every student, please, I really want to know your funding secrets. There must be some amazing way you're getting the money. So obviously that's not realistic for most scenarios, but in some cases, now please, some cases, it's not a universal, okay? Not all redefinition projects hit that high, but in some cases we have seen that type of improvement at the redefinition level. So those are the 4 levels. You have the enhancement levels, the 2 lower levels, and the transformation levels, the 2 upper levels with the higher payoff. But it's important to realize that all the levels have their value. None of them are, it's not good level, bad level, right? And you can build a SAMR ladder, okay, that takes you up, that says, well, we're going to enter at the substitution level because it's easiest, it's because that connects well to what I'm doing already. I don't have to throw away everything I'm doing, but then I'm going to build up to the point where I'm suddenly starting to do completely different things based upon this. All right. I'll show you a couple of quick examples here about the SAMR model. First one is on literacy and vocabulary. We know that vocabulary building is essential to student learning, development of literacy, but we also know that traditional approaches to vocabulary building don't work very well. So for instance, one of the traditional approaches would be give kids a long list of words to memorize, and allow dictionary, or tell them to look it up in the dictionary and write the definition, and then give them a quiz on it. It doesn't work, okay? It really doesn't work. It gives you, at best, a marginal improvement. At worst, it bores the students, more frequently the latter. So Marzano has been spending roughly about 50 years researching this topic, and this is from the latest book that Marzano has published in 2004, and based upon roughly 50 years of research, that's a pretty good body of research, says, okay, so this is what we found works in terms of teaching vocabulary. So if you look at the research, this does work. So the first thing the teacher does is the teacher provides a description of the term that fills out the story. It's not just a dictionary definition, it puts a story around it, it puts a narrative around it that fills it out. Then students create their own narratives around that, not just restate the teacher's definition, but create their own narratives. And then, very important, step 3, they also look to non-linguistic representations, images. Now the images need not be a direct, If the term being discussed, as we're going to see, for instance, is, let's just say, I don't know, the term being discussed is tree. The images don't just have to be pictures of trees. They can also be images of ideas that students associate with trees. They can be connections in different senses. But the key thing is that they use non-linguistic representations to fill out their understanding of the term, the process of creating. Very important, this is not supplied to them. The students have to create their non-linguistic representations to fill out that panorama. Then they periodically do activities that help them add to their knowledge of these vocabulary terms. So now they're going to be using the vocabulary in other ways other than what we've talked about so far. And two more steps are very important. They're asked to discuss the terms with one another. Very important that this not be through the teacher. If it's a discussion through a teacher, this is not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about direct student-to-student communication. So clearly we've got to have a meaningful activity that's going to provide tokens of exchange in a social network among the students to discuss this, to discuss how they're using the term. And finally, also give me an opportunity to interact with the terms playfully, okay? So being able to play with words is an important part of good vocabulary creation. Great, so these are the 6 steps. Marciano says these work. And Marciano, by the way, develops all of this without using any particular technology. Oh, and by the way, it's difficult, time-consuming, etc., to do this properly. Let's see if we can build a SAMR ladder that will both make this easier for us and also take it even a step further. Substitution level. We can get electronic texts, in many cases free or very cheaply online, and we make those available to students. In this case, I've chosen Charles Dickens because he's fairly international and fairly well known outside of England. And there's a key word in Dickens, and one of the key words is thrifty. And thrifty in Dickens is an interesting word. First, because kids in general don't understand the meaning of thrifty very well, but also because it's a word that evolves in its use in Dickens. It starts having positive qualities in the early works, and you go through the later works and eventually becomes associated with negative qualities. Very interesting development, and lots of analysis on that. So we have that, okay, substitution, we read it online instead of reading it in the paper. We also said substitution, having that dictionary pop up whenever you click on a word, so they have at least access to a basis definition. And one more thing. We said that the teacher has to construct this narrative around the word. But instead of having the teacher either just do it in class orally or put it on a sheet of paper, photocopy it, and hand it out to students. By the way, I'm going to date myself once again. And my temptation is always to say to mimeograph it for students. And then most people ask, what's a mimeograph machine? And so... anyhow, so they photocopy it and hand it out to the students. I say, no, let's put it on an online server. In this case, this is a kind of personal wiki that we use in Maine. It's called NoteShare, but you could do it with any other wiki technology or anything like that, and the teacher makes it available online. Still, straight substitution for that photocopy, but useful, as we're going to see in just a second, because we go to the augmentation level and we augment this in 2 directions. We use a tool like VisuWords to say, what's the surround for this word? How is it connected to other words, synonyms, antonyms, subsets, supersets of the word, etc.? What are the connections? And we do that visually. So we start giving students an understanding that goes beyond what's in the traditional dictionary and thesaurus. All of this information is implicit in the dictionary or thesaurus, but it's hard to pull out. The visual dimension now is a significant improvement. And the other thing we do is we tell the students, by the way, your stories, those narratives you write, don't just write them so the teacher reads them and tells you these are right or wrong. Write them into this wiki that we've put online, so all of the students have access to them without, again, having to photocopy a huge stack. And this is a functional improvement because, frankly, the photocopying of the huge stack, for the teacher to photocopy the one copy and hand it out to the students, okay, that's reasonable, that's what you did. But the huge stack of photocopies, I've never known anybody to have great success with that as a way of getting students to read each other's work. But if it's all embedded within this wiki, they have access now not just to the teacher's narrative and to their own narrative, but to all the other narratives. So we've created a social environment that's definitely at the augmentation level. Modification level, we said we wanted to create those non-textual representations of the word associations. Well, let's go ahead and do that. But instead of doing what the traditional exercise would be, which would be to just build a heap bag of images, we can use a tool, any type of concept mapping tool. In this case, we're using OmniGraffle because, again, that's a tool we've used in Maine, but you could use Visio or just about any tool you like for this. And we start saying, well, in addition to just having the images, but let's not just dump them, let's connect them graphically in ways that analogous to VisuWords, so the students will have already some experience with these proximities proximity, distance, types of connections issues. We link them to our different concepts, and we can also link them to other things, such as, remember I told you that the text, that word evolves in Dickens, so we can start linking to proximity and other works of Dickens chronologically, theme-wise, etc., and see what images are associated with them there. And we can also see how the term is used in other writers that we might be interested in looking at. So now we're at the modification level. This is not a task that we could have accomplished without the computer, easily or otherwise, and it's a significant redesign because we have the original task, which was collect the images, build upon what we were doing, but we're significantly redesigning it by bringing in this aspect of the graphical connections, the concept map that surrounds how all of these images relate to the concept that we're dealing with in vocabulary. At the redefinition level, we say, fine, what do we do? Well, the students have collected all of this, and remember, we still have a couple of things left over from Marzano that we need to deal with. We need for them to be using these in independent projects, for them to be talking with each other. We already have some of that going on, but we'd like a little more of that. And we also want them to have this sort of playful relationship to the terms. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give the students as a project something that is playful, that they can exchange as tokens of discussion and communication, and that of course allows them to exercise in different ways their understanding of the vocabulary concept, which is we can ask them to create a digital storytelling project. Here I've chosen output in iMovie, so to a video-like format, but I could have just as well chosen a comic book or interactive media, lots of other possibilities I could have chosen. I just chose this one because it's straightforward. And obviously they can bring in all the media, everything they gathered at the early stages, so nothing gets thrown away, everything is useful, and repurpose it here and add their own narrative, music, other ways, in fact, of thinking about this. Remember that Marzano deals with non-textual representations in images because that's what's most readily accessible, but you can start asking students what type of music you might associate with this and bring that into a picture, etc. And this at the redefinition level in at least two ways. The first way is that you can even do the project in the first place. In the days when, digital storytelling is not video, but we could say, well, this is most akin to a video project from traditional times. But if you ever did a video project with a class traditionally, you did one project like that, and when it was done, you were done. You didn't send the students to go back and re-edit and revise because it took too much time. You had limited resources. You only had so many video decks. You only had so much time there. The students had so much time. Invariably, you had technical glitches and difficulties to deal with. You just said, it's done. Here's my assessment for it. Here you go. We don't talk about this anymore. But here you have a tool that makes the project easy, so it's feasible for the students to do it. So the fact that you can really do it, and do it not just as a term-long activity, but as something that is reasonable as a component of an ongoing vocabulary practice is important. But there's a second sense in which this is also at the redefinition level. It's at the redefinition level because the tool is simply not to use, that you can go through a revision process, an iterative process where, just like good writing, we know that good writing depends upon a process of writing, rewriting, feedback from multiple audiences, etc. We can do the same thing here because the tool is easy enough, simple enough, and fast enough that you can do it. And what's more, you can do it in such a way that you're developing a type of visual literacy, a media literacy that you wouldn't develop otherwise. In other words, your students are becoming better digital storytellers, and in the process of becoming better digital storytellers, they're also becoming more literate about other forms other than traditional text. Finally, iMovie has this lovely menu option, but also again present in most video editors, that says export to YouTube, which allows the audience for these videos to go far beyond the individual classroom, so you've brought an authentic audience that can provide feedback. Once again, not something you could have done before, and something that the students can use as tokens of communication with each other, thus playing off Marzano's fifth point, but in a much bigger way. So that's a salmon ladder for vocabulary buildup. One other SAMR example I want to talk about, and that's the example here of the student historian. I argue that we want students to be historians, but to me a historian, or at least what we should think about as a historian, is not somebody that has just memorized a lot of dates, a lot of names, a lot of battles, and a lot of treaties, and so on. Rather, it's somebody that can say, let me look at historical raw data, historical raw information, and build something out from this, to build something that they can say, okay, I have different hypotheses. How are these grounded or not grounded in the data? Somebody else has brought a hypothesis to the table about what caused these events, what multiple causes leading to complex events. One of the fascinating things is it's never a simple single cause, single event result in history. Weigh those competing hypotheses, analyze, state, why one is preferable to another, and apply it to also, well, what's going on in my life in the world today. That's what I think we'd like our students to be as historians. Well, how do we construct Samuel ladders that enable that process? Here's one way of doing it: substitution. I don't know if any of you have looked or have taught with most textbooks on ancient Egyptian history, but it's one field I'm always fascinated by how poorly most of the textbooks I've looked at, and disclaimer, I've only seen one Swedish textbook on the subject, so maybe all the other ones are wonderful on this and I just looked at the one bad one, but I can tell you that I've looked at most of the ones used commonly in the States, in Spain, in France, several in Brazil, Argentina, several other places, and the quality is not encouraging. So that's an area where you can say, but there are good resources online that are free, well-designed, curated by people who are experts in the field, up to date with the current information. Let's use those instead of the textbook. Substitution, of course, but you've replaced a poor, expensive resource with one that's free or very inexpensive and up to date, and as I say, well-curated, well-maintained by people who are experts in the field. The BBC site is one such example. Augmentation. With the data that they derive from this, have the students start to create, for instance, maps using a tool like Google Earth to create those maps of, say, funerary monuments in Egypt, an important topic, and one the kids like to think about the pyramids and so on. Well, if all they're doing is just creating an electronic version of the map with the pointers to it, that's still straight substitution. But you can do more with a tool like Google Earth. You can say, for instance, well, create in layers markers for all the funerary monuments, but then create another layer with markers for key ports of exchange of trade in Egypt, and another layer where you have key agricultural areas in Egypt, and then start turning layers on and off and start looking for patterns. And you'll see that some monuments are associated more with one type of activity, others are associated with another type of activity, and some are associated with both. And then look back at the monuments and start seeing, well, are there different characteristics that tell you something about this as well? And you can also have these markers be hyperlinked, connected to resources on the web. So the map is not just a map unto itself, but it's also a gateway to other information. So you can click on a link and immediately see other images of the monument, more information about the monument, documents related to it, etc. So we're here at the augmentation level. Modification level. Any good architect will tell you the best way to understand a building is to build it. Okay, but unless you have a very large supply of sandstone blocks and of free manual labor, it's a little hard for students to build pyramids. Okay, so short of that, what can we do? Well, there's a tool, free tool, Google SketchUp, that we use in Maine, and it's an incredibly successful tool. It's a 3D construction tool. It's fairly sophisticated, but kids pick it up, in our experience, in under a week, they're proficient in the tool, and they can start doing amazing things with it. And one of the things you could say is, well, let's have them build, instead of just taking people's word for this is what the monument looks like and look at pictures. Well, no, say, let's have them build some of these monuments. Now, this is the Great Pyramid at Giza, and I wouldn't actually give that one to students because, A, it's a fairly late, complex building. I would rather have them build up the understanding. So instead, say, let's look at some of the earlier versions of pyramids, which were called mastabas, and let's have them look at the mastabas and give different ones to different kids so they can construct them and understand the function of the building and say, oh, wait, in this mastaba, you can look through the door and get a glimpse of the first chamber. In this one, you can't. Very important. Politically, who's going to be looking at the corpse or not looking at the corpse of the dead ruler or person of great supposedly designated merit in the society? Very, very important to telling you something about that society. You also understand functional aspects. Why does it have to be built this way rather than that way, right? Why does it have to be facing the Nile or not facing the Nile if you want people going by on a barge versus people walking around or coming in a camel around it to see different things, etc. In other words, you understand better the function of the building by constructing it. This is a significant task redesign. The task at heart is understand how the pyramids and other funerary monuments worked and why they worked the way they did, but you're significantly redesigning it because this is something you couldn't have done without the computer. You're adding an exploratory dimension to it that you didn't have before. Great. Redefinition level is what I called it, let's turn the students loose. Because so far I've had them explore the space of others hypotheses. But now let's give them a chance to explore what they might do. Now, one possibility I could have chosen here would be to say you've got the huge trove of digitized documents from Egypt, translated documents from wall inscriptions, hieroglyphs, and so on, and you could use contemporary large-scale qualitative analysis tools to go through that corpus and have them analyze it, sift out for information. That's great, and that is in fact a very valuable direction to go. But visually, I decided to go with something a little flashier for this one, but it's also something that kids enjoy, which is one of the things that people say is they couldn't have built the pyramids by themselves. Sometimes you'll find this in books. So a little flying saucer came around and beamed up this stuff. No, folks. The ancient Egyptians were bright. Okay, they had excellent construction techniques, and they actually even documented them on wall paintings. So it's not even like we have a huge mystery in terms of the fact that no flying saucers are needed. But there are quite a few topics that are very much open questions for debate. Did you use more labor or less labor? Was it a question of when we have trade-offs between how many people you can dedicate to the task versus the speed of the task? What's the result? For the size of the blocks, there are some people who would argue, well, you used smaller blocks to prop them up, or people say, no, you couldn't use the smaller blocks in the way you're discussing because they would have been crushed, so you have to use a different technique to raise some of the blocks. These are all good questions. They are true, open, historical questions that don't involve little flying saucers. Well, one thing you can do is say to students, construct your own hypotheses and justify it using modeling tools, because we can model this. This is a physical process, and there's a tool called AlgoDo that allows you to construct complex enough models that, in fact, you can start to get at the heart of some of these questions. So they can see, for instance, if you use this type of wood roller, would it have been crushed or not? One of the topics that you see on some of the wall paintings, did they lubricate with water ahead of the passage of some of these blocks? And did that change over time, and why? You see a change actually in some of the techniques depicted. Fascinating questions, and one that they can explore with a simulation tool like this one. So that's clearly something that's completely inconceivable prior to the advent of the technology, and that puts us also, it's a new task, it's at the redefinition level. I'll also point out here that this is also the type of question you're finding more and more, or the example I was giving you with documents, in terms of how history is done today. History is changing dramatically these days. What's called the digital humanities are really transforming the history landscape. And there are papers you could have published even 5 years ago and said, well, I only took 10 documents in this area, and I think that's good enough to justify my hypothesis. And today you'll get that journal article sent right back and said, no, you've got the tools, you've got access to it. We all see at least 100 documents being analyzed to justify your hypothesis, and not just say you cherry-picked the 3 documents or 10 documents that justify what you're saying. So that's it for the SAMR model. As I said, the SAMR model focuses on the question of how different levels give you different outcomes. There's a second model that we use in main in complementary form to it. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes on this to introduce its use. And that's the TPAC model. The TPAC model is a different question in hand. The TPAC model says, okay, great, SAMR tells you the different levels of use of technology. TPAC says when you're designing a new unit of instruction or remodeling an old unit of instruction using technology, what do you need to keep in mind? And the first key insight of the TPAC model, which was developed by Mishra and Kohler, by the way, was to say that you need to look at pedagogy, content, and technology all at the same time and all as peers to each other. So you can't say, I'll take my content, add pedagogy to it, and then I'll bring in technology, I'll do the design around that, and then I'll bring technology in later on. That's not a great idea, okay? Or even worse in some cases, I'll take content and then figure out the technology, and I'll figure out the pedagogy later down the road. That's where we've seen a lot of technology and education projects found. They said, no, you really want to overall be thinking about all 3 at the same time. Now, clearly, at different levels of the SAMR model, different focus will occur. So, for instance, at the substitution level, you may have more of a pedagogy content focus, less, and a somewhat subsidiary focus on technology, but that'll change as you go up the SAMR ladder. By the way, the TPAC is the acronym for Technological, Pedagogical, and Content Knowledge. That's where the K comes in the model. And I can tell that Mishra and Kohler were just as inspired as I was in terms of finding a cute name for it. So I'm guessing they also had a, okay, presentation in an hour. It's the TPAC model, and we're going with that. So that's one of the key insights. It's also important to realize that this is a true insight, because if you look at literature in the 90s, you'd find a lot of discussion of pedagogy and content being brought in together at the same time, with technology being added later on. And the key research of Misha and Kohler, if you go back to their work, was to look at those projects and say they haven't worked well, that you really need to bring in the technology simultaneously as a peer. The other key insight of the TPACK model, though, is to realize that when you look at the intersections, this defines 7 subsets of information that you need to have in mind as you're developing a unit of instruction. And I want to go through those 7 subsets very quickly. It's what I call a checklist. PK is pure pedagogical knowledge, just knowledge about how people learn. I put in some couple of resource examples just to show you the kind of thing, but please realize for each of these I could have picked thousands, in some cases probably millions of resources. So I'm just putting in a couple just to stand in. So for instance, here we have a site, the Life site, that deals with what evolving knowledge about how we know, how the brain works, etc., and the Haystack site, which looks at evolving patterns of learning in a cross-connected digital world. So these are topics that relate to topics of pure pedagogical knowledge, how we know, how we learn. Pure content knowledge, the core of what it is you're teaching, what it's all about. So for instance, for our Egyptian example, here's resources from the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Egyptian art, the Great Buildings Collection on the pyramids, and so on. So that's the core of the topic. PCK is how do you teach a particular content area using different pedagogical approaches. So here you're not looking at general pedagogical knowledge, right? It's pedagogical knowledge focused on that content area. And a couple of examples. History Matters site, by the way, it says the US survey course on the web. Many of the resources here, frankly, would apply to any culture. So it's a great resource in terms of how do you use tools to convey, how do you teach people about history. So here it's looking at pedagogy with a special focus on history. And here we have, for instance, the ERIC site, which is just a research aggregation site, but that has huge volumes of information on topics related to content-oriented pedagogy. Pure TK, pure technological knowledge, relates to the fact that we have a tool, and we need to figure out how to use it. Now, the standard resource, people say, is, well, user manuals, help menus, and so on. But I always encourage people to look at broader sources for technological knowledge. So, for instance, the community around the use of a tool. Or these days, I always frankly recommend go to YouTube and do a search, because one of the first sources is people will put videos on YouTube saying, how do you do X with Y? In this case, it's pure technological knowledge. How do I use, for instance, if I want to build a pyramid, how do I get inclined planes easily in Google SketchUp, right? And I'll bet you that if you look for it, somebody somewhere will have had that question and put a video of it on YouTube. TPK is how do you use technologies for pedagogical goals, okay? And again, a couple of resources here. One resource that I always like to highlight is the Horizon Report. The Horizon Report asks questions about relevancy of technologies to educators, to a panel of people, and I will have to admit I'm one of the guilty people for putting this particular report together. We take special care to make sure we're not seduced by the latest glitzy technology or get into groupthink where we start just rehashing around one idea. So we try to answer the question of what should schools be looking at in terms of pick 2 technologies that schools should have their eye on in the short term, 2 for the medium term, 2 for the long term. And every year we update the report. Obviously, technologies, as they come into the mainstream use, then fade out from the front, so to speak, of the report, and others come in at the back. Sometimes there are shifts. This doesn't mean that these technologies are the only ones you should look at. It doesn't mean that you must immediately devote all your school resources to them. In fact, you may decide, look at them and say, well, not where we're going right now. But it does mean that you should be at least taking some look at them because they have some particular relevancy. And the report is not just highlighting the technologies, it also provides explanation of why, uses in education, and exemplars that you can go out there, pick up the phone and call somebody who's doing something with them right away. So that's the type of resource that says, okay, so how do we use technologies for pedagogical goals? Or resources like the Chronicle of Higher Ed, which disregard the higher ed, you can use all of their tools at the K-12 level as well, which has bloggers, for instance, posting information. In this case, it's the Prof Hacker, talking about how to use Google Docs to run a peer review writing workshop. So these types of blogs, etc., are excellent TPK type resources. TCK, one of my favorite topics and one of the ones that frequently gets neglected. How has the technology changed that content area that you're teaching? So I just told you about history, and in fact all of the humanities are being transformed right now by the introduction of technology. Mathematics has already been transformed over a longer period of time by the introduction of the technology. We could get into the whole history of that. It goes back to the proof of the four-color theorem, the first theorem ever to be proven with computer technology that could not at that point in time be proven just by simple human action, and that created a whole transformation of how math is thought about. Well, you're seeing something similar happen in the humanities right now, and in the social sciences, etc. So the question is resources that help you when you're designing a new unit of instruction or modifying using a unit of instruction to think at the same time, how is what I'm doing here being changed? How is that content being changed as we speak by the technology? Last but far from least, TPCK, where it all comes together. And here what I always recommend is look and see what other people have done. So look at repositories such as the Open Courseware Consortium, which shows you what other people have done in courses using technology. Just go through and browse. Maybe there'll be something that for what you want, maybe not, but at least give you a series of ideas, or courses that have been specifically targeted towards this type of redefinition work that I've been talking about. One of the ones I always use as an example is Digital Storytelling 106. It's an insane course. It's an insane course in more ways than one. It's a completely open course. Anybody can join from anywhere in the world. But if you're looking at digital storytelling and rethinking what digital storytelling is and how to get at the heart of it, Jim Groom, known as the Reverend to his friends, I'm not going to tell you why, you'll have to find that out, has done an incredible job in terms of putting this together. It's one of the resources that I always say, would you want to teach the S106? Not many people are insane enough to deal with the huge volume of work that this entails and the amazing shifts in perspective that are involved. But it's a great place to get ideas that you might use in your own work. All right, so that's TPAC. And again, in terms of what we're doing in Maine, we use both of them complementary. We use SAMR to help think about the levels of use, TPAC to say, do I have everything I need on the table? We're almost done here. I just wanted to spend just 2 more minutes to show you what I would call pathways. The pathways are particularly promising avenues for what can happen. And I've identified 4 pathways that each of them rely upon a key fundamental human aspect: social, narrative, play, and visual, in terms of the potential that developments along these pathways have to get to the higher levels, to the transformation type levels of usage. Social computing. The social computing revolution is upon us, but sometimes we're not using it in the classroom as effectively as we could. And you've heard it throughout my examples. So keeping in mind, how can you bring in that broad world of social computing? And also think not just about blogs and wikis, but Twitter, Facebook. There are some very interesting questions, some of which we don't have answers to. I'll tell you of one piece of research that I have from Maine that we just finished collecting. One thing we know, students and collaboration. When you look at students' primary tools for collaboration, many people thought the answer was going to be, the number one was going to be phone. Not even close. Number one is Facebook, by a very long stretch. Number 2, texting on phone. Number 3, chat tools. We still haven't seen phone show up. Number 4, phone. And a very distant 5th, email and so on. Bottom line, sometimes what we stress the most in school, email, is one of the, as far as students are concerned, least effective ways to collaborate. So that's the first thing. Students are using these social nets and these social tools to collaborate, and it's what we see them using most. But one of the questions people say, but if they don't have access to them, or we tell them don't use that, use email, they'll just use email, right? No, they just collaborate less. And when they collaborate less effectively, and we see an actual impact on student performance. So many people say, but if they're on Facebook, they're going to be distracted. Sure, they're going to be distracted some of the time, but you know what? You have interesting enough tasks. They're also going to be collaborating, doing other things on there. So are there trade-offs? Of course, there always are trade-offs. But it's worthwhile exploring that world because, as I say, we see great value in it. Digital storytelling, again, I've already mentioned it, but digital storytelling, that capacity to bring in different forms of media across a broad range into a narrative is a huge hugely important tool in terms of what we see, and it crosses subject areas. Some people say, well, in literature, right, or maybe in history. I say, no, in math, for instance, we see great uses of digital storytelling when students apply their thinking for narrative skills and narrative tools to how their mathematical thinking evolves or showing other people mathematical thought. In the sciences, it's a very broad range there. Educational gaming, a tricky one, but an interesting one. Educational gaming, not just in the sense of go out and use one of the standard educational game tools. Frankly, many of the standard educational games are pretty poor. But instead sometimes of using standard games or games are not designed for education, using them in different ways. One of the most successful examples, for instance, I don't know if anybody here plays is the game Civilization. Okay, and its different incarnations. It has been used successfully in history teaching classrooms. Now you look at the world that Civilization describes, and you say, wait a second, but that's too simplistic a view of history. Of course, nobody said they use Civilization as a model for history, but it's a great model for thinking about the types of processes that feed into history to get kids off the single cause type models, look at multiple compliance, and then you say, well, of course, this is a simplified toolbox. Let's look at the assumptions of the toolbox and see where it fails to work with the world, and then let's build a more sophisticated model than we can do with this. So there's that type of use. There's also a type of use in educational game of having kids build games to instantiate their understanding of a topic, to share understanding of subsets of topics, etc. The Quest to Learn school in Manhattan is centered around that particular use of gaming technology. Finally, visualization and simulation. One of the things that computer technology allows us to do is to look at complex sets of data in terms of ways that we could never have done before. And I showed you in the vocabulary example, a very simple example for networks, but in fact there's, if we're looking at the images, etc., and the words are connected with each other, but this is a much broader aspect. And for instance, if you look at language, we now have tools for visualizing how language flows in novels, in political documents, historical texts, that allow students to see patterns they didn't see before. In the sciences, we can have the students working with real data from the world, not just the toy data they could get from a very constrained demo experiment in the lab, but actual real data from the field. You know, we work a lot in Maine with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, the GMRI, and they work with real food webs, not toy food webs in the ocean, because one of their tasks is the preservation of the habitats in the Maine coast, both, you know, for multiple reasons and multiple approaches, and they work with students, and the students are not working with a toy food net. They're working with food nets. That's the simplest one is 78 species, if I recall correctly, and that's the simplest one. And students are thriving looking at these complex ecosystems and developing that, but partially and largely because we have the visualization tools to allow for that, and also simulation tools that allow them, as we talked about in the case of the Egyptian pyramid, to construct those models. So just to wrap up from one of my favorite topics, which is digital storytelling, I just want to show you the spectrum, because sometimes when you see one of those little bubbles I showed you in the previous slide, people tend to focus on a single approach. And to me, digital storytelling is not one item, okay, but a whole range of items. So I can go from assemblies of images to sequential art, comics, to moving image type projects, like the iMovie project I was showing you as an example, to interactive media, where the media response follows different pathways according to reader interests, to interactive fiction, which brings in a ludic, a play-like element into the whole aspect. At each stage you can bring in, I'm not going to go through this in detail, we need to spend much more time on it, different additional aspects, different additional concepts, each of which adds richness to student communication, to student storytelling, to student narrative. And all of this can be used in any subject area. So you see that what you have here is not one approach, or one, you know, when I'm talking about digital storytelling, I'm not just talking about do the iMovie standard traditional digital storytelling approach with each one. I'm talking about a broad palette of approaches, and that would apply to any of the bubbles, with a range of tools. And again, I've got a few exemplary tools here. You also got tools that have weird mixes of this. For instance, Prezi that allows you to create an infinite canvas, which is like a comic without page margins, if you will. That each of them allow you to bring different aspects, different richness into the picture. And just to show you, if any of you are interested in, I'm showing, I showed this, the previous slide are tools that are PC or Mac-based platform, but some people say, but I want to do this with young children and we're going to use iPads for young children. I say, no problem. Here you go. Here's the equivalent thing done on an iPad, and those are the tools that you can use. And finally, I point out that whenever you have this type of digital storytelling project, you can start bringing in other aspects, what I call analytic storytelling, by connecting to the social sphere, so for instance via Twitter, by connecting to this place, the geographical sphere, the creation of maps, and by connecting to the time sphere. So digital storytelling projects, again, this is, if you will, trying to explain also some of the richness that can branch out from this, can connect out in these different dimensions in ways that allow you to bring, as I say, what I call this broader analytic storytelling that brings in the tools for visualization and analysis into the picture. All right. So that's just a quick panorama of the analytics tools that can come in. So for instance, you have maps, timelines, network diagrams, symbolic math representations, and visualization of language as some of those types of tools that I was showing you in the previous diagram. And that's it. So for those of you who are interested, all of these slides will of course be available to you. I'm going to upload them to my site. And you have here my contact information. The slides will be available here. You have my email information. If you want to follow my Twitter stream, that's where it is. These days I've been a little bit quiet on Twitter, but I promised several people that I will both blog and Twitter more frequently in the coming days. So, that's it.